Chapter 2. It would normally have been a pleasure for me to be Riki again for the first time in many years. Had it not been for the tragic circumstances of our visit at Edinburgh Station, Grayshaw hailed the first cab on the rank, producing a sharp intake of breath from Holmes, who would of course have taken the third. It was but a short ride to the shell of the Empire Theatre, and we passed my seat of learning. We gained the street. As we descended from the web, we noted that the theatre facade still bore publicity for the great Lafayette. Many idlers in Paris investigated this more closely were it not for the considerable. We noticed a big Mercedes standing right outside the theatre. It had large capital L's emblazoned on its door, together with a likeness of the dog Beauty. It has been there, tragic, said Grayshot, but Holmes showed little interest in it, peering ahead through the guarded lobby. Golden Eagle searching for its stray lamb. There was, however, nothing sheepish about Inspector Dougal. Greeted us Caledonian trustiness. The inspector was short for a policeman, only a shade over the usual minimum height. He had a shaggy head, of graying hair, and mustache to match. He spoke with a husky Wigan accent, though without the difficulty with the letter T experienced by any denizen of great city. I can no need for it. I've heard details interfere. Any. Well, in that case, Inspector, I will just to my friend, colleague, Rector Cutham. I did be Doctor. Man, I've read your scribbling in the Strand. Tell you, father, I have no idea why Grisha pair of you. Holmes asked, are you devoting time to her? And busy with illegal slaughtered island started. How did you know him? Wolves. But he must have told you. How did he need to be told, my mud upon your is of article upon still bear traces of hairs, particular in the Scottish Highlands. Notice what slight tendency to hair blood shows involved 2 or 3 days ago. A good look tall man, left-handed, and McLeod all but lost his temper. And wrongdoer apprehended is in Glasgow. Owl now. came here to investigate in case arson was involved. Very much doubt a given circumstance. You and your nosy friend are welcome to look around. As Greyshot wishes it, don't get in my way of the police business, whatever you do. Rather to my surprise, accepted all his rudeness, great dignity and charm, simply saying, "Remember me to Lestrade when you see him, my dear Inspector. Now, Watson and I will take advantage of your kind invitation. Inspect the scene of the tragedy. Watson, not take up any more of the inspector's valuable time." These necessities completed the inspector's grudgingly. Loud assistant, a Sergeant Ferguson, show us around the ruined theater. He led us through the grimy but smoke-damaged auditorium, where a number of people were sitting in the seats close to the orchestra pit, which had survived the fire. The sergeant told us that there were all interested parties of the inspector still. He wishes to interview surviving members of Lafayette's company, stagehand, and other involved parties. He led us between some columns toward the proscenium and up steps, which were between this stage and the lowest of the. From the top of the few steps we turned to our left, and he led us through the glass door. Inquired, "This be the infamous door which was locked when it should have been safe to exit?" The sergeant nodded. "There are 2 or 3 other such doors, but at least the others was another off by." Holmes mused. All this to preserve an Elixir's secrets. A terrible price to pay. The sergeant grunted. Newberger himself was responsible for breaking all the safety rules. Paid the price. We examined the door, and then Holmes inquired as to where the bodies of the victims were being kept. The policeman said, "Well, some of them are with the local undertaker. Others have been sent home to their grieving families." There seemed little point in keeping them. Holmes asked, "What of Newberger himself? Where is his body?" "I would like to see it, and feel that it has not been sent to America." Ferguson replied, "No, sir. The Glasgow to an undertaker." I asked, "Why not to a local undertaker, dare I ask?" The sergeant shrugged. "I do not know, but perhaps the inspector does." It was Greyshot who told us why the body had been sent away, and we spoke with him following a cursory examination of the ruined stage area. This was sad to see, and it looked like a scene from Dante's Inferno. After the flames had been quenched, it was back in the auditorium. But the solicitor told us something to do with his will. Had to be a certain type of undertaker. It seemed a little vague, but Holmes was suddenly possible to have the body returned, untouched, here to Edinburgh. The inspector snapped. Man, I knew I should not have allowed you to interfere. What possible point would there be in having the body returned? He was burnt to a frazzle he can only identifiable by the shred of the costume he was wearing and the sword he carried in his hand. Holmes was firm. I would still like to examine the body. The inspector breathed hard. I cannot stop you. It is between you and Grayshot here. The solicitor told us that the body had been sent to Glasgow in an early morning train. The undertaker proved to be an old-fashioned firm without a telephone and sent a telegram. Please return Newberg's body intact, just as received. Stop. Sherlock Holmes. The wire, which arrived back within 2 hours, read, returning Newberg's cadaver. Stop. You were too late. Stop. I've already processed it. Stop. Cannon and Carsters. Holmes laughed bitterly. Such an enterprising and prompt service, friends. Cannon and Carsters operate. However, we must do our best, even if embalming keeps secrets from us. We took a cab to the station where we impatiently awaited the train from Glasgow. It was not that the express was late, but just that we were early in case it should arrive ahead of its scheduled time. When at last it pulled in amidst smoke and the grinding of the wheels upon steel tracks, we were already precisely in its place on the platform to be in line with the guard's van. As a van door slid sideways, Holmes was eager to see which he needed: coffin, or at least a packing case, with the look of the box that might contain a grisly sarcophagus. Alas, no such sight greeted our eyes. The van appeared to contain only a basket with live pigeons, a large crate with a furnishing company's trademark stenciled upon it, a lawnmower with a label to its handle, and with a number of sorted packages. When Holmes demanded to know what happened to the body of one Sigmund Neuberger, which we were expecting, the guard handed him a small wooden box, saying, "You will have to sign for the poor gentleman. Wouldn't like to have this done to me when I'm gone. I don't hold with these newfangled ideas. No fitting to burn the dead, I say." As if in a trance, we let Grayshot sign for the rated urn of Newberger's ashes. We stood there for what seemed like an age before any of us spoke. Then at last, just as the train was being prepared for its return to Glasgow, Holmes said, "Upon my word, he has been cremated. There's, to my knowledge, no crematoriums in Edinburgh, which explains why the body had to go to Glasgow." "You had no inkling of any of this, Grayshot?" The legal man was greatly embarrassed. "None at all. I will have to look again at his will. My apologies, Mr. Holmes. There has been a slip-up entirely through my own carelessness." We took rooms at the Royal Caledonian Hotel, the very establishment at which Lafayette himself had been staying. The staff were easy to extract information from concerning Newberger, but mostly it was about the eccentricities regarding his dog. The maids would be full of stories of how they had to make the dogs a special bed each morning, changing the silk monogrammed sheets. The waiters would be more than willing to discuss the serving of the many courses, the dog's dinner. One of them even said, "Aye, they tell me that the wee beastie died of the apoplexy, but 'tis my belief that she was pampered to death. Ye can." We took a light hunch of cold fowl washed down with tolerable hock, as we tried to calm the all but frantic Grayshaw. He had done some preliminary readings of Newberger's will and said, in rather an animated fashion, not only slipped up, but on the point regarding the cremation. But I helped to identify the body as being that of Newberger. Holmes calmed him, yet I could tell that he was seeking more information as he did so. "Oh, my dear fellow, you had no reason to believe that this body, wearing remnants of great A. Lafayette costume, and bearing his sword, was anyone other than Newberger. But regarding the missing diamond rings, it occurs to me that these might be missing not through theft, but because they are still upon the fingers of the real Newberger, as yet undiscovered. Let us return to the theater and see what else we can discover. I must, in any case, give the ashes into the hands of the good Inspector MacLeod." There was only the faintest trace of irony in his voice. We walked back to the theater with Holmes insisting upon treating us to his discourse upon the sights of Edinburgh, with which I was more familiar, but I knew, as ever, there was a method to his madness, for I knew him well enough to know that he was mentally framing exactly what he needed to do and say back at the Empire. He had insisted upon opening the crate so that the urn containing the ashes were more portable, and he carried it himself into the raffia shopping bag, which was a part of my fishing equipment. Grayshot watched the agony as he swung the bag in his hand. Inspector MacLeod was not entirely delighted at our reappearance backstage at the Empire. He snapped, "Well, Holmes, what have you got for us in your wee bag? Some clues to the tragedy, such I call for it." For there are no mystery. Holmes brought the urn forth from the bag and said, "But there is a question of uncertainty, my dear MacLeod. I must hand over to you the ashes purporting to be those of Sigmund Newberger or the Great Lafayette, whichever you prefer to call him." The inspector took the urn and said, "So he has been cremated. Well, that makes it all rather more simple. It is not as if we have his body to worry about anymore. Holmes snapped. Sir, the body might have told me something that I might wish to learn. These ashes will tell me nothing. I expected a body in return for my wire. McLeod was almost epileptic. You interfere with my case and wire for the body to be sent to you? Man, he had no right to do that. Fortunately, I have no further use for the body, cremated or otherwise. Sherlock Holmes remained icily calm as he dealt with the irritable Scottish detective inspector. His voice took on a firm tone, whilst he was still extremely polite. He said, "Firstly, sir, if you had, as you state, no further need for the body, then why should my claiming of these ashes on behalf of Mr. Greyshaw, who is my client, concern you at all? But, my dear McLeod, before you answer, let me add that you should still be seeking Newsburger's body." McLeod's eyes dilated as he said angrily, "Man, are ye daft? I hold his remains in my hand." Holmes said, "Eventually, when you find the actual body of the great Lafayette, you will realize the sanity of my statement. That is, if you find it." The inspector handed the urn to an underling. With a gesture of dismissal, he walked away from us. After a certain amount of experiment, we managed to find three of the splendid plush tip-up seats which we could occupy. A row or so behind us, a row of similarly functional seats was still occupied by a number of persons who doubtless awaited McLeod's pleasure to be questioned. But since we had last seen them, a couple of fresh faces had appeared in their midst. They were those of a white-haired man with a matching walrus mustache, wearing an expensive-looking greatcoat with a velvet trim to its collar, which was turned up against the draught. The other was that of a younger man with a dark suit and holding a document case. I guess I would have said that he was the servant of the older man. Grisha recognized him at once and waved hand as if in salutation. The distinguished-looking man nodded curtly to him and muttered something to the police constable, who appeared to be in charge of the group. Evidently having been given a leave of absence, he made for where seated, motioning the other man to follow. We arose from our seats as Greyshaw introduced us. "Sir Edward Moss, allow me to present Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson," he continued. "This gentleman is the owner and director of the great theater chain which bears his name, and to which this once splendid empire belongs." We shook hands, and Sir Edward spoke with a keen lipped speech of one who is used to having his own way. He said, "My dear sirs, I know you both by reputation, I can assure you of my generosity in the matters of fees. If you can throw some light upon the tragedy, which has some rather mysterious aspects. Holmes replied sharply. Sir Edward, I am a retired from professional work. When in the midst of it, I always operated a fixed set of charges, which I never varied, save where I omitted them altogether. I was on fishing holiday and came here at the request of Newburger's solicitor, Mr. Grayshot. But do tell me of the mysterious circumstances to which you refer. The theater magnate was obviously not used to being put in his place and coughed irritably. Then he brushed his fingers, said, well, the outbreak of the fire itself is a mystery. This is a brand new theater designed for me, architect Mr. Matcham, and only very recently opened. It's incorporated every possible safety device against such a tragic occurrence to make it safe for all patrons and players alike. Safety curtain, the very finest of make and design, did not operate smoothly, and the fireproofing of all backstage property and construction entirely failed to be effective. A backstage safety regimen was completely ineffective and exists. Entrances remained blocked off. Of course, Lafayette had a lot of elaborate and curtains, that of which his own, but all of them were checked regularly regarding fire safety. When he played when he played theaters, always passing on, told that fire was caused by something hanging, a lantern perhaps, touching a piece of curtain. But I doubt that drapery fireproofed just like the others, and the fire must have taken hold at some incredible speed. Holmes replied sharply, Sir Edward, theater magnet was obviously not being used. But when in the midst of it, I always operate on fixed charges. Theater magnet was obviously not being put in his place and coughed irritably. Then he brushed his fingers to his mustache and said, well, the outbreak of the fire itself is a mystery. This is a brand new theater designed by me, by my architect, Mr. Matchman, and only recently opened. It incorporated every possible safety device against such a tragic occurrence to make it safe for patrons and players alike. The safety curtain, of the very finest make and design, did not operate smoothly, and fireproofing of all backstage and constructions entirely failed to be effective. Backstage safety regimen was completely ineffective, and exits and entrances remained blocked. Of course, Lafayette had a lot of elaborate properties and curtains of his own, but all of them were checked regularly regarding fire safety. When he played our other theaters, always passing all tests, told that the fire was caused by his hanging lantern cutting a piece of curtain, but I doubt this. That drapery was fireproofed just like the others, and the fire must have taken hold with incredible speed. Holmes nodded. I had doubts too when told of how the fire started. I've tried to investigate, but as best as I could, but have not been encouraged of my activities by Inspector McLeod. Not that I can blame him, of course, for not wanting his official investigations tampered with. The police are pretty universal in that respect, but there is another, perhaps more pressing aspect to all of it, in that I believe that the body sent to Glasgow for cremation was not that of Sigmund Neuberger. What? Sir Edward's groped for the monocle and screwed it into his left eye, as if increased vision might clarify this matter. He spluttered. Then whose body was it? Where is Neuberger's? Holmes characteristically took out his pipe and started to fill it with the Scottish mixture. We had to wait until he had charged the pipe and produced critic blue smoke through the application of a lit vesta before he replied. I cannot, Sir Edward, immediately answer either question. Given more opportunity to investigate, I might answer the first. Do you have any photographs of the entire Lafayette touring company? Sir Edward clicked his fingers, and his servant, whom appeared to be secretly, smartly removed a folio from the document case and handed it to Holmes. The detective opened it to reveal about a dozen photographs, uniform in size, about 8 inches by 10, which appeared to be of the kind intended for display outside of the theater. Holmes spread some of the pictures for inspection, asking, May I retain these for a day or two? Moss shrugged and said, You may keep them, for obviously I have no further use for them. Grayshot Holmes and I peered at the pictures as Holmes spread them out. He said, One of these may give us some clue to an aspect that has already been crossed my mind. Rest assured, Sir Edward. I will keep you informed as to my progress, subject to approval of Mr. Grayshot. Moss grunted as he prepared to depart. Be sure that McLeod will not hamper your inquiries further. Once I have had a word with him, he nodded, and he and his secretary returned to that group from which they had earlier emerged. Holmes picked out a photograph for further and more detailed special examination. It was not, as were most of the others, a picture of some aspect of the Lafayette presentation. Rather, it was a group of persons standing upon the steps of the front of the theater. There were 5 men forming a front row with some half a dozen women peering between the spaces between their heads. These women were evidently standing on a shallow step which raised them in height. To one side stood 2 people, very much smaller than any other in the picture. As he gazed at the picture, Holmes said quietly, "Watson, you have just had a good lesson in how to deal with 2 pompous persons at once by setting one upon the other, who are the very small people at the side of the picture, Grayshot." The solicitor replied, "Alice Dale and Joseph Coates, both of whom unfortunately perished in the fire. Alice was valuable to Newburger on account of her diminutive height and petite build. In an animal costume, she impersonated a teddy bear, and being something of an acrobat, she made this impersonation popular with younger members of the audience. Newburger became anxious that she had no understudy, so a dwarf, Joseph Coates, was employed to understudy her. Holmes took his lens to the picture. "He is a midget rather than a dwarf, Grayshot. See how well proportioned he was?" He directed his gaze at the other in the photo. "This is the entire Lafayette Company. I understood there was more people involved." Grisha replied, "The dozen or so depicted are the principals, a trope that remained mainly unchanged. There were, of course, various supernumeraries and girl dancers who were frequently being changed." Holmes nodded and passed the picture to me. "What do you make of this picture, Watson?" I looked at it keenly and then said, "Well, aside from the number of men and women and the 2 small people, I have little to add except that obviously Newburger is the central figure in the front row, the dog at his feet. I see little else of any moment." Sherlock Holmes pointed the handle of his lens over the central figure. "Newburger appears to be a man of average height, almost the same, in fact, as a man who stands on his right. The other 3 men are taller. Who is the man on the right?" Grayshot, Charles Richards, principal assistant, also missing and presumed to have perished in the flames. Holmes nodded wisely, and having asked the identity of several of the other persons in the group, he closed the folio, having returned the picture to it. He handed the folio to me for safekeeping and said, "Come, let us visit the main scene of the tragedy again." Inspector MacLeod greeted us with mock charm, having evidently received some kind of message from Sir Edward Moss. He grinned slightly and said with an integrating sarcasm, "Oh, Mr. Holmes, how nice of you to grace us with your presence yet again. Tell me, have you made any great deductions yet concerning our little problem?" Holmes smiled indulgently and said, "Nothing much yet, Inspector, except that I believe I can identify the body that was cremated in error for that Sigmund Neuberger. The inspector started, and his expression changed to one of concerned disbelief. What do you mean, man? Explain yourself at once. Holmes replied calmly. It transpires that he who was cremated was in fact one of Charles Richard's right-hand man and confidante to the great Lafayette. Something of the confident tone with which Holmes spoke made McLeod quieter in his skepticism. How do you arrive at that conclusion, man? Holmes removed the photograph that we had been studying and showed it to McLeod. He pointed out similarities in the height of the two men, saying the other men are all above average height. The inspector looked uncomprehendingly at Holmes, saying, there are several male bodies impossible to identify. Holmes almost snapped. Check the height of each male cadaver, and I'll wager that they will all be 5'9" or more. Neuberger was not tall, and neither was Richards. Dressed in an identical costume and holding his sword, it could have been easy to make this mistake where the features could not be identified. The police inspector clearly still did not fully understand, and neither I, confessed, did I. But Holmes enlarged upon his theory. Very sharp. When you described some of the wonders performed by the great Lafayette, I realized that despite your assurance that no identical twin was involved there, nonetheless, there must have been some kind of double employed. A man cannot be in two places at once. I have little faith in the supernatural, so Neuberger had to have a trusted employee, at least near to himself in height and build, so given the sword and the shreds of burned costumes as the only form of identification, I believe my theory deserves your consideration. Had the body not been cremated, I believe that I could have found other things to match. I believe that I could have found other things to bear out my belief. Also, we have the fact that the diamond rings have been missing from the so-called Neuberger cadaver. McLeod brightened as he said, anyway, Wallace, you have been theorizing. I have made a discovery in the real importance. Follow me and you will see a sight that might give you a horrible surprise. We followed him backstage, where he pointed to a charred pile of rubble in a corner. Following his dramatically pointed finger, we saw amongst the charred debris what appeared to be a human hand. I gasped. How did you happen to miss finding such this earlier? He replied, it showed up when we started to shift some of the rubble, and it having lain there hidden, I imagined some poor fellow got his hand caught up in something, and he burned to death, his hand protected by some masonry. Holmes looked skeptical. I very much doubt it. Inspector McLeod rounded on him fiercely. What makes you say that? Holmes replied, because it is an imitation, doubtless made for theatrical purposes. McLeod was sarcastic. You can tell you can tell that, can you, by looking at it from 6 feet away? Holmes retorted. Excellent eyesight, especially for one of my years, Inspector, and I can, even from this vantage point, see a newsprint exposed where the heat has raised the paint at the wrist and is fashioned from paper mache formed by repeated layers of torn newspaper. McLeod looked startled for a moment as the full truth of it was proven by his actual handling of a grisly object. He tried to make us believe that he had known the truth all along. He said, "Just a little test for you, Holmes, but sharper than I suppose." He was, however, from this point onward, a trace less arrogant in his attitude. He even agreed that Holmes might question some of those whose patience was fast becoming exhausted in the auditorium. First, however, my friend decided to make a more thorough examination of the fire scene itself. The burned remains of the lantern, which was supposed to have started the fire, still hung over the entire stage. Holmes stood upon the box to examine it more closely. Then he said, "McLeod, may I suggest that you examine the remains of the lantern more closely, and you will find that it is of electrical variety, though somewhat low powered. I understood that an actual flame lantern had been involved." McLeod motioned to a constable to see the lantern. I wondered about that. An open flame would have been asking for trouble. With the back of the stage now in view, though, through the collapsed of the burned drapes, stood a twisted heap of metal bars and steel sheets burned nearly black, which had once been the lion's cage. We were told that the poor roasted beast had been removed from its wreckage. He eventually returned to the auditorium, having examined a few other pieces of burnt debris. We were informed that Sir Edward Moss had decided to take himself off, permissions or no. The rest of the weary looking persons involved still sat there.